3 times the size. Yeah. America is like 10,000 and Canada is and you are here?
Yeah, for now, yeah.
And of course you follow the news and everything, what's happening there?
On a semi-hourly basis. Like, yeah, it's all around, like, part of the project that I'm taking part in, the Aleppo project here.
Yes. What is it? We heard about it. We come from Greece, both of us.
Yeah?
I'm a professor and Jasper is my colleague and assistant at the Navarino. She runs our think tank. Yes, so...
Which is it, sorry?
I am in Athens, she is in Thessaloniki.
Which think tank, sorry, what's the name?
It's a very small Navarino network, and we are partners in this big EU grant that we are here for.
Yeah.
So, what is the Aleppo project about?
It's a quite multidisciplinary project with research as well. Generally research. You know, when you have media, you do research, but at the same time, not necessarily in the same rigorous methods. So we do a bit of like what would look like media, quick responses.
So you do media yourself?
We don't define ourselves as that, but like we do try to account for some of the things that are happening, like the important events and all of that. But so that's one side of it. A lesser side, but we do research in general in specific public policy. This is the discipline of the director of the project. Myself, experience with cultural heritage, even though I'm a linguist in English.
Originally, you were English.
By training, yeah.
You studied in Aleppo or abroad?
In Aleppo. Yeah, until I was 25, I never lived.
So you were born there, raised there, and
I never lived abroad until 2012.
In your wildest dreams or nightmares, would you have ever imagined the catastrophe?
Not the scale, yes, but not the scale. I should tell you more about it. 10 years ago, my father and I had a talk. He was telling me about what's going to happen, but we didn't imagine hydrogen. He told me about tanks. He's a general professor. So he knew. He saw the city. He saw this sectarian tension.
So there was no tension before 2011? Between the regime, the Alevis, and everybody.
Exactly. I mean, you know, sometimes superficially, yes, but in essence, in this part also, yes. But like, you can't say that, for example, ocean were dissatisfied.
No.
Some were, yeah, but like generally, yes, this, what do you call it? Dissatisfaction with the way power was concentrated. It ended up being concentrated in certain regions. So the coastal areas, these people.
Do we start?
Yeah.
It's too soon to start because I think they're still in a coffee break.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah. And so Lataki and Tarsus, they got all the jobs.
Exactly.
Whereas
especially in the army and secret service. That was... These influence other sectors. This in the secret service make it a deal for many other things. He can decide if his son goes on a scholarship or not, for example.
No, yeah, sure. And is there any book you get right now?
Not the way we wish for it.
It's still is burning, the fire is... Yes. No, it's as the Russians are. Do you go on television? Do you?
I mean, yeah, if I'm invited
because there aren't that many people who know what they're talking about, especially from inside Syria, and who speak good English like you, and they have how should I put it bluntly, a face Westerners can identify with,
yeah.
which is an asset if you want to get through.
I mean, it talks to some, maybe not what aspire to generalize or to try to float anybody with, but it definitely gives you access.
I mean, BBC, you should do more media.
Yeah?
For the sake of Syria. I mean, the Syrians at least, because Syria is no more. I feel it won't get back together anytime soon.
Yeah, unfortunately, you're right.
How do you travel? I mean, with your Syrian passport, you are okay?
Yes.
So if you want to go to London?
I never tried because I didn't get
You need a visa.
it's not much.
But the rest of the Schengen, you're fine.
Exactly. As long as I didn't go
Which is a research.
I mean, ideally,
A research visa you have. I mean, at the start of the year.
it's under the category of so not student, not worker, not family, but other, which includes researchers, things like that. So, yeah, but it is hard. Even to see issues with areas that can't go there.
Why not Turkey?
They have been.
They have been.
They've been trying to punish the EU. They say like, no, you're not taking.
Yeah.
So no, we're not going to give Syrians visas.
So you cannot get in legally.
Yeah, are you waiting for us? I hope not. We're ready to silence. Okay.
Hopefully.
Like I have a colleague here, someone who's doing his master's, who was just telling me about the Turkish embassy. They told me, or not why are we here again? Like you came here before. Like, yeah, I'd like to apply again, but you didn't get it. So why are you here? I was like, well, maybe I have another plan. He's like, yeah, you know, it's hard. Only 10%. You know, we have 3.5 million. We have more, a lot on our plate. Like he was telling him that. Why are you telling me?
Yeah.
I'm not the 3.5. I go for my own way. And I promise him this back as I couldn't do it.
Yeah. What should we be watching for the next 6 months? But if I were a journalist and I want to go on, TV, what should I know for the next 6 months to be careful about?
Okay, I think we should be starting. My name is Bogdan Radu. I'm a visiting researcher at the Center for European Neighborhood Studies here at CEU. The first announcement is a bit more logistic. There will be a class here starting at 5:20, so unfortunately we should try to wrap it up within an hour. So I'll kindly ask the panelists to maybe stick to 10 minutes presentation. That's of course not to say that what you have to say is less important, but rather an unfortunate situation. I myself am interested in the migration phenomenon. I'm Romanian and I'm doing a research project on Romanian migrants in Spain, and actually my specific interest is in how the whole refugee issue is processed by, let's say, migrants in Western European countries that have arrived there before this whole thing happened. I've only conducted a few interviews so far, but the news were not good. So basically migrants are also perceiving this refugee thing as a threat. But I don't know if we'll get into it. I cannot promise you the same level of intensity that we witnessed in the previous panel, but we'll see how it goes. We're happy to have 5 speakers for this last panel. I suggest we stick to the order here. So first we'll have András Kováts from the Hungarian Association for Migrants. Then we'll have Prem Kumar Rajaram from the CEU's Open Learning Initiative. Then Salome Scherer and Felix Bender from Migration Solidarity Group. And last but not least, Esther Kosha from SOS Children's Villages International in Hungary. And I hope I didn't butcher your name. This is just to show that language is not necessarily a barrier when we're looking to accommodate migrants. So, 10 minutes each, please.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to be able to talk to you. I hope I will be able to talk to you because waking up this morning I felt my voice was sort of disappearing, so I might cut it even shorter than the 10 minutes I was given. I try to stick to the title, which is Civil Society, Refugee Crisis and Social Integration, with the presumption that the civil society will be represented by us here, so maybe let's try to, at least this is why I'm trying to speak from a civil society perspective. And then the question of integration, especially as it is being reframed for the past year and a half, 2 years, on one hand as a consequence of the events along the thing which we call the refugee or migration crisis, and also as a reaction to the changing social environment of people being as refugees or other beneficiaries of subsidy or protection. I want to touch upon 3 issues which are usually related to social integration. The first is talking about integration as a set of policies. So many of us, when we talk about refugee integration, in fact, we talk about the programs, the services, the entitlements. I already heard these remarks, and so whether these are in line with integration or not, or whether these facilitate integration or not. But there's another approach, which is more about the relative or even absolute social status or social position of certain groups or individuals. So when we talk about integration, we talk about the situation of a person, of a community. So how well they perform in the labor market, what is the level of their education, to what extent they speak the language of the majority society. So we can have a discussion on this. And then the third issue, which has been coming up quite frequently in Hungary, I guess in Europe in general, is the question of public attitudes, or the reaction or the disposition of the so-called receiving or mainstream society, be it the local community, be it the rhetoric of the political elite, be it the framing of the whole issue in the media, which eventually provides a certain window of opportunity or an opportunity structure for the people who stay in those communities for a shorter or longer period of time. The fundamental question, and actually this is what we have been facing a lot recently, is the question when does it start? So when we talk about integration, what is the starting point of it? So should we, Menedék has been dealing a lot with integration, but we seldom frame the work what we do as integration. So sometimes we are with an audience who has this language and has this approach or understanding, and obviously that we talk a lot about integration, but we very often talk about social services in general, or welfare-oriented support, or social support, or psychosocial support, where the outcome is not necessarily kind of interaction, what we label as social integration. Or we can also have an approach saying that however short the period of time people spend together, it's still worthwhile to frame it as integration, or to talk about integration. You remember we had this debate in the previous panel about being it a transit country or a destination country, and if there's any policy consequences. And it was interesting to hear the representatives of the authorities, but also it was interesting to hear the questions and kind of the implied message behind the questions. So so it's like a chicken and egg debate, whether it is a transit country, which then implies a relatively restrictive welfare policy, because there is no point in investing into those people who eventually leave the country, or it is the contrary, people leave the country because there's no sufficient framework in which they could set food, or they could start a new life there. I think what is important is the temporary aspect of it. So however short the stay is, I think it is still meaningful to consider it an integration process. If it lasts only for a couple of months, still somebody merits the different stages of an asylum procedure, it's fine. Sometimes it lasts only for a couple of years. I mean, you know, blaming people for leaving the country after 2 years of stay, which is the maximum period of the integration benefit. I mean, on one hand, I can understand. I mean, if it's a social investment on behalf of the government, but on the other hand, like if it is nothing which is given in return for any merits, then simply that's a cycle of someone's life. I mean, how many of us have already spent even shorter periods of time abroad, feeling at home, feeling integrated, feeling sort of interaction with the local communities, and still like belonging to Hungary by the legal status is something which stays. So I mean, this whole starting point is a very, very difficult issue, and the question whether reception is included, so the first phases of it, the transit zones, the detention centers, the open reception centers, the time people spend in a country as asylum seekers or asylum seekers in their appeal phase, is crucial. And obviously these are the issues that have been discussed a lot recently when the crisis came in and when all these emergency measures took place. And it created a lot of problem for many of us who work in the field of social welfare or social services, because the crisis somehow attracted not only the attention but also the resources and the energy of the agencies involved. So they were a lot discussed about and debated about the policies around entry into the country, access to asylum procedure, the question of and the quality of the reception conditions, and then very sort of silently other measures took place in the background which were not as evident. Some of you mentioned it already, that the integration system was completely dismantled as one of the government reactions to the crisis, which is not apparent. So if we only talk about asylum seekers coming into the country, only talk about the pressure on the institution by those people who are not necessarily in need of asylum, who are not necessarily ending up in Hungary, it might even be a sort of a logical, meaningful argument. However, what happened here was installing measures which affected the fate of people who have already been in the country, some of them for years, and also the fate of those people whom actually nobody debated and nobody challenged that the country should and in fact is willing to provide protection for. And I think this is a very difficult situation right now. There is no, and also it's an easy point when it comes to talking about it, that there is no integration policy formulated at the level of the government measures, simply saying that a refugee shouldn't be entitled to more than an average Hungarian citizen is entitled to. We can get back to this story when discussing the issue. There's another development which is brand new and quite recent. It happened only 2 weeks ago, that the new multi-annual plan of the European Fund for Asylum, Migration and Integration, the multi-annual plan was presented by the government, and apparently we discovered many integral parts of it simply missing, such as labor market integration, such as facilitating the access to citizenship, such as facilitating the family unification of people, such as working with the majority society in order to create a more inclusive Hungary. And when we commented on the draft, we got a pretty explicit answer from the Ministry of the Interior saying that this is no longer on the agenda of the government, and this is no longer part of the national integration program, even indirectly, even when redistributing European money. So I think this is a very difficult issue. And two more words, if I may. One about the other two parts, which is interesting. One about social status. So when it comes to actually, so how refugees live in this country, looking at survey data, looking at qualitative data, though the last targeted survey on refugees was conducted, I think, a good 7 years ago. And right now we are in the middle of a qualitative inquiry, which is just a set of interviews with refugees. But when we, sorry, that's my voice, sorry. So when we make analysis of existing macro-statistical data controlling for countries of origin, time spent in the country, and social status, it always comes back that those countries where the majority of refugees come from are usually represented among those groups and populations which are pretty much excluded, which are pretty much marginalized, which are performing much less well on the labor market. So the general notion that refugees are not faring that well, are not faring as well as ordinary immigrants. Hungary used to boast about its immigrant population being above the average in terms of employment, in terms of education. This is definitely not true for refugees. So there is a big discrepancy, and there is a big marginal. I mean, you can interpret it as a marginalization, but also you can interpret it as an entry point into the labor market. So over time, this situation can be solved and can be sort of, this gap can be made narrower. However, this is exactly where those type of investments would be needed, what have been cut by the government. And the last issue is about public attitudes. We already heard that this is a xenophobic society. However, I encourage all of you to dig a little bit deeper into the public opinion polls, which usually go beyond these one-dimensional notion of whether, I mean, aggregating certain variables and then labeling people about xenophobes or xenophile or liking or disliking immigrants. And actually what we see that there's a polarized discourse going on right now. There are definitely changes in average due to the government's communication and government's propaganda. However, the perception of the problem of the population, so whether we talk about refugees or we talk about other type of immigrants, or even whether we talk about different ethnic groups and communities, is very, very differentiated. So the ordinary Hungarians still say yes to receiving refugees. Even more of them say yes to receiving refugees if it is not unconditional, but if it is somewhat proportional. And only when the issue of economic migration, I mean, whatever it is, I'm not using this term, but this is how it is labeled. When the issue of threat, when the issue of cultural differences are coming up and emphasized, then this is the time when people actually start becoming more refrained and more cautious. And actually, this is what we see on micro level, that we don't really see big clashes and conflicts when it's about finding jobs, for instance, to people. We've never been so successful in finding jobs to refugees than the last half year, which is obviously related to the changing economic situation. So there's big need of labor force in the labor market. But this is exactly what I'm saying, that if there is pragmatic local need, if there are certain criteria and points of view which can be formulated at the level of local communities, then it is, I'm not saying it's easy, but it is still possible to create an environment where there is opportunity for people to stay in Hungary and to start a new life, usually in the bottom, but then there is perspective to climb up as well.
Thank you. I'll cut my links to very short, so yeah, Prem, if you'd like, yeah.
I have a short PowerPoint, which is why I'm standing up. PowerPoint is not strictly necessary, it's just basic information about the project. You want to know how to make this?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's in the bottom.
At the bottom.
Thing at the bottom. There.
Yeah.
So, good afternoon. My name is Prem Kumar Rajaram. I am one of the co-directors of something called the Open Learning Initiative. I also teach at Sociology and Social Anthropology Department at CEU, and I am Academic Director of the Roma Access Program at CEU. The Open Learning Initiative, it runs two programs. Something called the Weekend Program. We call ourselves Olive for short, partly because it's cute and partly because it sticks in the mind. And something called Olive Up, the University Preparatory Program. Our program, we are not an integration program. We are explicitly critical of the word integration. As András says, we use the word integration when we need to, but we are critical of it. We try and emphasize this critique. We are critical of it for two reasons, primarily because integration, the way it is phrased, the way it is articulated in policy and elsewhere, it is a fundamentally unequal procedure. It is about people who have to integrate into something that already exists. This is problem. The second reason why we have, why we question the idea of integration is that because it creates a far too simple and linear policy aim. We integrate people by giving them jobs, we integrate by creating job opportunities, creating education opportunities. It doesn't address the basis, the capacity of people to be able to enact or use the rights that are on paper attributed to them. The Hungarian case is, of course, a very obvious example, which is that all refugees have the same rights as Hungarians. They do not necessarily have the capacity, and not simply technical capacity like language, to be able to access those rights. But often people, refugees, asylum seekers in Hungary, lack something very intangible called a community support. A community, something that we know, that we grow up in. People like me who've migrated here, we have the support program. So the most important thing about Olive, in my opinion, is besides all of these things, is also the fact that what we try and do is that we try and create a community of support. We try and establish as much as possible a non-hierarchical set of relationships with our students, in the sense of trying to establish a safe space where there can be horizontal engagement with people, one of the most gratifying aspects of all it, for us at least, has been how people have got together, how our students have got together to be able to form, to create senses of community, friendships, replacements for family, support networks. For me,